Well, good afternoon and welcome to Talent War Group episode 38. Today we're talking about A players selecting A players. For anyone who hasn't dialed into one of these before, please go ahead and interact with us so that we can have a discussion that's most value added to you. If not, I'm going to talk about whatever I want to talk about, and that's what you get. So with regards to A players selecting A players, it is a true honor to have George Randle on this call because he literally wrote the book on the topic. So if you haven't read The Talent War, you need to, and start off by going to chapter 8, where he actually discusses A players selecting A players. And with that, I'm going to throw it to you, George, so you can give a quick intro of who you are.
Well, thank you, Miss Lisa. I wrote the book. I, after my military career, enlisted officer, spent 23 years in the HR and talent acquisition space. They made me figure out how many people, for our marketing campaign, how many people we've hired. And I think it's north of 85,000, the teams. And then I met, my brother, Mike Sorelli, and as I like to tell the story, he was watching Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, or was forced to, and then he uses it as an excuse to call me and says, "Hey man, we need to write a book." So we wrote this book, and very, very well humbled by the response that we've gotten. So glad to be here.
And we're definitely glad to have you here, George. And Dalton.
No, it's definitely an honor to be here with both you, Lisa, and George, and Taryn. Could not ask for a better panel to do this. I think this really shows the depth of this conversation and A players surrounding themselves with A players. I'm former Army Special Forces. I was on the enlisted side, so I won't hold the officers against it. But we all work together, and it's definitely a pleasure to be here. I'm currently the chief executive for the city of Morgan's Point Resort on the public sector side, and so it's kind of an interesting take to take the HR component, the leadership component, and as an interviewee and as the hiring manager, how does all that kind of play into it? So thank you for having me.
Of course. And Taryn, can you please introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi. I'm Taryn, former MH-60 crew chief and rescue swimmer in the United States Navy. Transitioned out in 2017, and now I'm an executive search consultant for the Talent War Group. So pleasure to be here with all of your friendly faces.
And she is killing it too. Killing it.
The best part about Taryn is she's going to make sure at the end of this that anyone who paid attention gets some takeaways, and she's going to help tell which of us is the coolest, because it's a competition to see who gets quoted at the end of each episode. To try to lead into the discussion, you get a bunch of military people together. Everything's a competition, right?
That's right.
So to lead into the topic, one of the things I love to do is use really simple examples. Talent War Group, as you can tell by our resumes, a lot of us, or almost all of us, have a military background, and everyone has some sort of association with the military with regards to consulting or something that assisted in professional development within the military. Well, not everyone who listens to Talent War Group discussions has those same military backgrounds. So don't worry, you'll get plenty of no shit, there I was stories in the next hour. But I want to start with something simple. When I was playing kickball, and yes, I played kickball in my 30s on the Shell Oil Company team. And when you pick your team, you don't pick the losers to be your captains. You don't pick your B and C players to be your captains of your team. You literally, even when playing adult kickball, and by the way, it was kickball and may or may not have been a drinking game was associated with the kickball. Just to throw that out there, I was living in New Orleans at the time, maybe showing a little too many of my cards here. But when you picked these teams, you had your A players picking the teams. You had somebody who was competitive, somebody who was driven, somebody who was value-based. Obviously, kickball values are a little bit different than running a business, but it's common sense when you're picking teams. to have your team captain be your stars and your A players. For some reason, as we grow up and mature, some of us growing up and not necessarily maturing, we lose that lesson and we start making our HR team, our recruitment team, our interviewing and hiring team not our A players. And what you're going to get is you're going to get somebody who's makes your interviewers feel comfortable. So as an A player, you're going to pick people who drive you and motivate you and push you and make the company better. If you are not an A player, are you really going to pick somebody who's going to be a high achiever, who's going to push hard, who's always searching for that next innovative idea? And I truly believe the answer is no. So in the book, and again, I'm going to go to George right after this so that he can kind of give a rundown of the points he made in his book. But in the book, George and Mike even talk about the fact that it's important to pull your A players, your star players off the field to have them recruit and be 100% focused on that recruitment and hiring process so that future teams can be developed. So I'm going to throw it over to you, George, and see what other points you want to bring out about chapter 8 of the book.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. It's great description. That's exactly how we pick people. Well, the impetus for the chapter was there's two things. Mike and I were kind of bringing the best of special operations and talent acquisition. And so there were two pieces that collided that really drove the chapter. And one of those was I have been privy to so many interviews. I've lost count, but where they've swapped hiring managers out, they've like, hey, you're available, go do this interview. And they've never worried about the candidate experience. And hiring has been a secondary function. And so that was very commonplace throughout all the companies I've been with. My peers would echo that same sentiment. You're always worried who is or who is not going to show up for the interview process for top talent. And the second part of the equation was the example of Mike Sorelli, which all of you know if you've listened to Mike Sorelli, truly a break glass in time of war kind of guy. He's the guy that you want out front and has been out front leading the fight against our enemies. And he had so many combat deployments, and the most painful moment for him was pulling him off the line to go teach newly minted SEAL officers how to be ground force commanders. And the Navy did that for a very, very good reason, because he's the one that can bring the experience. And so we combined that with the idea of the only way that you're going to get top talent in the door is a great experience, and that knowing A players have the humble confidence to say, you know what, that lady or that man is going to be additive to this team, and they're not in fear of superior or more intelligent or more accomplished people. They gravitate towards that, and they can see that in other people. So that's really what drove the chapter from the start.
So George, I kind of want to, I finished a book today, and it's 5 Levels of Leadership by John Maxwell.
Yep.
I'm sure there's more than a couple people who are listening today that are familiar with it, but it's kind of interesting that I finished it today because Talent War Group put out a poll this morning to see what people were really going to be interested in discussing during this podcast. And the winner was how well we work as a group. And how I see that is, okay, well, we bring in these high performers, we bring in these A players. Well, not everyone on your staff is an A player. So when you're bringing these people into the team, how do you integrate? And I'm actually going to start with you, Dalton, because you made some comments before we started with regards to integrating the teams. And I was curious on your thoughts with regards to bringing those A players into the team.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's interesting to talk about this, because when we talk about the poll and how well we work together, what's really, I think, interesting about this that the viewers don't get to see is we all come together literally 10 minutes before this. We chat about a little things, and we all integrate together on this we don't really brainstorm, but we talk about each other. We adapt to the situation. We adapt to the world around us. We adapt to our environments, and we take the knowledge and experience is from each of us to bring to the table as a whole, even if we're not working with each other every single day. And more focus from the chief executive side, taking the information from George, from the hiring managers. We're in the process of hiring a finance director now, and even after talking with the candidate initially, now we've said, okay, how's the team going to fit? Where now my A players are going to do a panel. Now they're going to talk to them and say, okay, how are they going to integrate as a team? How are they going to be able to adapt to the culture? And to echo George's point real quick, special forces is the same way, even as the enlisted side. The difference between, I guess, SEAL commanders or SEALs and special forces is NCOs really run SF teams. The officer kind of sits in the corner and we send him up to battalion if we need something. But it really goes to show that the A players on the team are sent, just like George said, are sent to the training. They don't send, the turds, I guess you could say, for lack of better terms. They send those who are going to bring in the next fighting force, and the next, combat ready person. And even now, even talking with our directors and our department heads, working together is essential. But my job is ultimately to get them to take my job, because the more they learn, the more they bring to the table. One, the more productive they're going to be, but two, they know that their leadership has their back, and they know that we can adapt to any situation that's going to come our way in the dynamic, especially in public safety.
I'm going to dovetail right into something you just said, Dalton, and that's with you're really hiring people to eventually take your job or even take over sections of your job. Mistake number 4 is hiring as a secondary function, right? And so I'm going to take talent war and tie it into the 5 levels of leadership, which is in the 5 levels of leadership, they talked a lot about, Maxwell talked a lot about having pride in who you choose. So whether it's Mike's story of being taken off the line and becoming a trainer, or what Dalton said with regards to you're really building your replacement, or it's 5 levels of leadership in, if I'm a level 4 leader, I need to build up level 3 leaders. I need to get myself to a level 5 leader so I can get the people who work for me to a level 4 leadership, meaning I need to improve myself so that I can continue to improve those who are on my team. I don't want to say beneath me, because we've all worked on teams where the junior guy oftentimes has more influence than the senior guy. And Dalton just mentioned that, of course, with his completely wrong reference with how officers function in the military.
Thank you for correcting Dalton on that matter. Thank you very much.
Yes, that could not be left uncorrected. But yeah, so having pride in who you choose is a huge aspect of the hiring process. And I'm going to bring that back into the working well as a group. And another topic I was listening to today with, I drive a lot. I got these audiobooks going kind of high speed in the background, which is about team players. Your best player isn't necessarily your best team player. So that's another reason why your hiring team needs to really understand the mission of the organization, is because having that really great individual contributor doesn't necessarily improve your team, and therefore might not be the best hire, might not be an A player, because they're too much of an individualist, I guess. George, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. For me though, I think it's more my personal criteria that to be an A player, there has to be a high degree of team ability. But there are those moments where you have individual contributors, especially because I've recruited in the IT space, where you may have an A player that needs to be heads down and the best coder, the best programmer and stuff like that. But they generally have high team ability. And, to your point about picking better people. I'll give you two great examples. Selecting Carly for our president. Just, most people would kind of bypass somebody like that, or actually you, Lisa, you'd even be a greater, just as equal example, which is, it was so great to bring you onto the Talent War group. I haven't been to West Point. I didn't go to Ranger School. Had those orders pulled from me, but I was grateful because I went to the Berlin Brigade, so all worked out. But that's the great thing about A players is you're always looking for that person to be very additive. And if you don't select that person with high team ability, they're going to be disruptive. But I get your point. You are going to have a few of those stars that are top performers, but at some level they got to integrate with the team or it becomes dysfunctional.
And the actual example I was listening to today was with regards to basketball. If you've got a guy who can do the fast breaks and dunk, that's great. But somebody still needs to get the rebounds.
Yep.
Somebody still needs to pass the ball off. And again, sports analogies are a really simple way and logical way to explain A players and teamwork. But for some reason, we don't often translate that same priority into the business world. I'm going to go to a question here real quick. Dalton, I don't know if you have an answer for Weston Davis, who is asking if you are an A player, but you're being interviewed basically by a B player. How do you get him or her to choose you versus the status quo?
Hey, it's good to see you again, Weston. I know you've been on a few of our podcasts, and Wes and I, we chat a few times. This is a tough one. This is one of those questions I'm probably going to punt to George to kind of see what his thoughts are on this. Because in a way I was kind of the underdog and even for this role, and it came down to me and somebody who had 18 years of experience, and really the simple response that I gave was, well, just because you have 18 years of experience doesn't mean you know anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a risk, but it worked. And I had some A players on my side that really kind of helped encourage that. So I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. It's a challenging one where I think we just have to keep hustling. But what are your thoughts, George?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, if you're on the talent acquisition, the HR side, you shouldn't even be putting B players in there. That's the point of the chapter, because B players will select B players and C players, whatever the hell the cat dragged in. I mean, seriously, and I've seen some just, oh yeah, what a wonderful person, and you're frightened. But I've had to do a number of interviews in my career, moving jobs and careers, and when you interview with a B player, yeah, it's really, really dicey, because you don't want to come over the top of that person. You want them to feel valued. You want them to see you for your worth. And I hate to say this, but what I've had to do is kind of pull down and make sure I'm talking at that B player level and driving a relationship. Because at some point, if I come into that company and they select me, I'm going to have a relationship with that B player in some way, shape, or form. So I've got to build that connection with everybody in the interview process. But admittedly, Dalton, you're right. It can be brutal. If you interview with a C player, then it's probably time for you to just check out of the interview and say, yeah, thank you, appreciate it. No parting gift. I'll be on my way.
But to George's point, and I would say the silver lining to this
Mm-hmm.
is that's why there's a talent war group. That is why there's a talent war. And the cop-out answer is, these things take time and influence. But as we continue this process, as we continue to change that culture across the talent spectrum, and these HR spectrums, it's going to change. And gals like Lisa and Taryn and George, myself, who are in these positions, who now can put those A players in the room, who can say, you know what, I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. Let's bring in this talent. That's going to change the game drastically.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and that's, adding Taryn to the team, adding Lisa to the team. Not that this is going to be a complete love fest here on a LinkedIn Live, but, it's, that's the thing about A players is you have the humble confidence to say, you know what, we need to get this person on the bus. And every coaching engagement, every time that I've coached executives, it's about getting the right people in the right seats. Now, something popped up in the room I needed to address really quickly where, I think they said, leave immediately if B players are interviewing you. I would tell you kind of pause on that, Because the reason is that if they're interviewing you and the A player sees you as an A player, it may be that they have a B player in that process. That's fine. You need to be looking at the entirety of the picture and the person that you're going to work for. And if the person you're going to work for is an A player, and if I'm interviewing and I get to work with, and I come to an interview panel, but I know I get to work with Taryn, I get to work with Dalton, I get to work with Lisa, hey, I'm on board. So even if there's somebody in that process that probably, is a few digits shy of triple digits on the IQ scale, I'm going to stay in for a while.
It's funny that you mentioned that, George, because I was going to address Chris Marion's comment as well. Leave immediately if they're sending B players to interview you is what he said. And I had to giggle because yes, exactly. It does tell you something about the company, but it might tell you either A, the company hasn't figured it out yet, or B, they figured it out, but they just don't have the requisite staff yet. And that was another thing you talked about in the book. And I hate to quote you, but talking about having training for interviewing is huge.
Yeah.
And it's something, again, corporations really fail. Hey, you're an A player, go ahead and go interview. Well, how does an A player know what an A player looks like without having a little bit of in their toolkit?
Yeah, they do. And it's, when I was talking with veterans on the webinar and talking to them, about interviewing, one of the things that I tell them about interviewing, whether you're a candidate or whether you're a hiring manager, is it's like we've all fired the M4 at one point. But you have to train on it. You have to get the basic training on it. Then you have to keep moving towards proficiency. And the same thing is true with interviewing. If you're a hiring manager, you're always trying to improve the quality of your questions, that you're digging in and eliciting the responses that get the candidate to tell you whether they have an attribute or they don't have an attribute. The other thing is too, and this is fair warning to everybody, you absolutely as an HR professional and as a TA professional should be training your hiring managers, because there is nothing worse. I could tell you the horror story of the world, and Terrence heard me told it. I had a hiring manager go in, I had trained him on interviewing, and he met this rather rotund woman, and he was trying to build a relationship, and he said, oh, by the way, congratulations, when are you due? And she said, what? So just to drive home the point that you absolutely need to be training them not only what to say, but what to stay away from, because people drive that likability factor, which we talk about elsewhere in the book, which is people try to do. And in doing so, they get away from good, pre-formatted, pre-arranged questions to elicit the right answers. So training is, with everything you do in any function, is so critical.
And I want to bring up another concept with regards to those interviewers that might be A players, but don't necessarily come off as A players. And I fell into that category for a while. Hard driving, I knew what I wanted, technically proficient, but in companies that I worked in as an engineer with a heavy asset development in the front end engineering and design. So the really technical part of engineering before construction. Well, a lot of times I was interviewing because I had a construction mindset. I was interviewing for the construction. And in a lot of the companies I worked in, they were hiring and promoting with regards to who the best engineer was, because it was an engineering firm, but how they're looking at it. I'm looking at, I want to bring somebody in who's going to do project integration. And I'm looking at these aspects of what I need in that new hire, where somebody over here who is in a manager position, but they excelled as a technical individual contributor, and therefore were promoted ahead of other technical contributors. They're looking for completely different things.
Oh, yeah.
So also when you're looking at those hiring managers, what are they hiring for? And do they understand the positions that they're hiring for?
Yeah, it's one of the big things that we talked about. And I've actually been coaching a number of clients. Even before you get to the interview, the biggest mistake that people make is not defining success. What does success look like in that role? And what you talked about, Lisa, is there's that, that default engineers, in very narrow focus or, technical niche. But I think, and I want to hear what Dalton's got to say, but I think he understands better than anybody, when you're promoting and interviewing, what people miss is that the entirety of business is an ecosystem. And so, yeah, you're hiring for that role, you're hiring for that team, but Dalton probably knows better than most that it's a whole ecosystem. It doesn't work. So that player, in some way, besides just fitting to that team, has to fit the entire ecosystem. And I know that that's so critical to how he interviews people.
No, you're absolutely right, George. And, a great example, our administrative services director, I usually put her and our city secretary and some others together, and they work great together, but they're two completely different people. And that's important because they see two different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So when I go into a room and say, okay, I have, we call it the good idea fairy in the military. And I usually say, hey, sometimes you got to shoot my good idea fairy out of the sky because it doesn't need to be on the table. It doesn't need to be here. And I bring them two in and say, hey, look, here's what I got. Here's the issue that I have. I'm thinking this. I'm considering this. What are your thoughts? And I'm going to get two different answers, but it's a sounding board because I don't know everything. And I can't pretend to know everything. And I'm going to kind of segue a little bit into this month's kind of pillar. And I think a lot of this boils down to resilience. It really does. And two, I apologize if I butcher the name, but Kalisti Callison, had kind of, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but talking about just keeping your head down, having that go get it mentality where you're always striving for that next rung of the ladder, maybe not even that next rung of the ladder, but always challenging yourself, always pushing yourself to do more, professional development, personal development, pushing others. How do you tone that down? I think you took this out of my playbook, and I think everybody on here to a certain extent, feels that way, because when we're around other talent war group, colleagues, we don't ever feel this because we all, even if it's, constructive criticism, we take it for what it is and we embrace it. We enjoy it. We learn from it. We grow from it. We never feel like we're beating each other down. And if you ask right now, who's the smartest person in this room, nobody's going to point a finger at each other. It's going to be at everybody else.
Yeah.
And that's what's great about it, because when I think A players are one of those things where everybody can identify them. And I think we hide behind, or I think B and C players hide behind that intimidation of it. Getting a little controversial here is everybody can identify an A player, but the A players want to bring those A players in, where the B and C players are going to tone the A players out. And there's always going to be an excuse. You're not qualified. You're not experienced. You have something else. Toning it down is tough. And I think it boils down to resilience and persistence. And I tell my wife, when she's looking for jobs, she's a nurse. And I'm like, well, call the hiring manager. Well, I haven't heard from him. I said, well, call him. Well, I don't want to be overly persistent. Well, if you're overly persistent and they don't like you for that, do you really want to work for a company that doesn't admire your persistence in doing the job and excelling? And so toning it down is extremely tough. And none of these things come easy. I don't have good answers because I feel your pain. I've hit rock bottom on a couple of them trying to grind it out. But you got to focus on you. Continue every day professional development, read books, do these podcasts, look it up, listen to other podcasts. Surround yourself with those like-minded folks that you want to be with. A players surround themselves with other like-minded A players. And the more you do that, the better your life is going to be. And eventually, as you keep hustling and as you keep being resilient, you're going to find that culture that you want to be a part of and that team that you're going to share your drive with. So I hope that answers your question.
George, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to add to that because they chimed in and said radically candid. And so that comes from the book Radical Candor. And I happen to know the author, and I hate the book, just to be honest with you. And Lisa Jaster, do not read it. You'll get to page 3 and you will burn it. It's bad. It's not the radical candor. We all do that. But one interesting thing to the question is that Dalton, Taryn, Lisa, and I have all had to lead C players because we've all been in an environment where sometimes in the military you get what you get. And so first and foremost, we want to develop every person on the team into the next level of proficiency. And so it involves building that relationship. Yeah, there's going to be times where we have to kind of change the level of the conversation, but you have to meet people where they are if you're going to help them grow. And one of the things that all of us know well, people don't give a shit or don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so one of the things at the Talent War Group we've done individually and collectively is making sure that we're always investing in those players. And if you have a C player, you invest in them to the point where you know that they're not going to be a B or an A player, and then you fire fast. But you have to do the investment first. And all of us have done that, and it's tough and it is painful. I mean, there's times where I've had to deal with people, rather have my teeth drilled without anesthesia, but that's the burden of leadership. It's about building better people, and we've all had to do it and face challenges. So it's about building that relationship, invest in them until you realize it's not paying off, and then out. Sorry, that was radical candor.
No, and you know, and I'm gonna just add on real quick to this one. You know, we had another comment, I think, from Dr. Hader Mosin. Sorry if I butchered your name. There's not just three types. I think there's the three types that you kind of mentioned, but there's the fourth, and that's the A player. That's the one that's going to bring all of those. That's going to be the one who takes the time to invest the ones that miss life. That's going to be the one who doesn't have an idea of what's going on, but they're going to find their strength if they can, and they're going to capitalize on it. And they're going to take the designers of the game and they're going to build upon it even more. And so, so I would say add that fourth person, and that's the A player, and that's the person we're talking about here.
Well said.
And I'm seeing a lot of comments with regards to being the A player, not necessarily the hiring manager or somebody who's on the hiring team, and being in the process of interviewing. One piece of advice I have is, if you really feel like you're a high performer, you don't have to bring your whole self on that interview, but you do have to bring your real self. And you will never be happy in any career choice if you try to perform and be on stage for that HR interviewing panel. We've talked about it a bunch on previous Talent War Group podcasts, but when you go in for an interview, you're interviewing the company as well as the company is interviewing you. And if you're not honest, if you're not candid, maybe not radically candid, but if you're not candid, you're going to put this version of yourself out there. And then you have to either abide by that or be extremely unhappy 50 to 60 hours a week. Because let's be honest, there are very few A players who start a new job at 40 or less hours a week. It comes home with you, you get married to it, it goes to bed with you, your husband or wife knows who all the trouble spots are at work. It is part of your life. So make sure that you're not toning yourself down too much. And when you do, you're bringing your real self into that interview process.
Yeah, it's critical. And, I've coached a lot of people in their careers over my time, veterans and executives alike. And that's just a brilliant point, Lisa, because what I've shared with people is see things for what it is, not what you want it to be. And also don't be somebody that you're not. That authenticity level, if you're interviewing with me and you're not authentic, I'm going to know in about 60 seconds. It's not even going to take me that long. But the other thing is, and this, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but what's important is I've interviewed a lot of people that were A players that we didn't select. Because the A player, the role that we had wasn't the next best thing for them. Being that A player and finding the right opportunity involves you being authentic. And if you're not authentic, to your point, Lisa, you may create a picture where someone makes a hiring decision to bring you on board and it's not your next best role. And that's very difficult in your career if you're not paying attention. So authenticity counts, even though it may mean that somebody doesn't give you an offer. There's a reason for that. And it may be in your best interest that you weren't selected.
And along those lines, you might not be selected for that job, but your name is in the queue, or at least in the back of their mind. And when the right job does come up, the right seat on the bus opens up, you might either be in line for that, or I just got one up yesterday, which is, hey, I was talking to somebody about an opening that I had and your name came up. Either you or someone like you, are you available for this job? And part of being an A player is you step out of those traditional hiring roles where you're answering questions or taking quizzes or making sure that you have certain capabilities. It goes into the attribute development. It goes into networking. It goes into presentation. It's, again, a conversation I had today with in the last week with someone was, hey, if you've only interviewed somebody once, you have no idea what you're going to get.
Right.
There has to be more exposure. And it doesn't even have to be face-to-face. It doesn't have to be George interviewing me. It could be George interviewing me to see if I'm good, and then George talking to Dalton and Taryn to see if Dalton and Taryn think that I'm value add to the position required.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, just as a snippet for anybody that's listening, one of the most difficult, brutal questions that I ever ask executives that I'm interviewing is simply, if I weren't to hire you, who would you recommend for this position? Yeah, I know. I can be a little bit of a pain in the ass when it comes to interviewing, but it's a fair question, because then if I hear somebody say, you know what, I know A and B, these two people, and they're awesome, I can see right there humility, I can see authenticity, and I can see that they're looking for our company to get the right person. And if they answer that in that way, I'm like, I probably want this person, because they're pretty humble. But it's a very interesting question, always gets a lot of good responses.
So something I want to throw out to either of you guys is going back to selecting that hiring panel and who's doing the interviewing. So I'm going to do a scenario. I'm a manager. I need a new person for a defined job. How do I pick the other people in the office to sit on my side of the table as I'm interviewing? Are there qualities I look for? Should it be all of my friends from the company? What am I doing to make sure that as a hiring manager or as a manager who needs to fill a spot, that I've got the right people at the table?
Well, I don't know if you want to chime in, Dalton, but I would say this. First and foremost, it's people that want to make the team better, people that you know are committed to winning, and making sure that those people, it's going to be a primary duty. People that are like, hey, I know what we're building here, Lisa, on behalf of you. I know what we're trying to create as a team, and I have a stake in that, and I want to make sure that I add to that. So those people that have the motivation, that are an A player, and it may be a B+ player that's trying to move into an A spot, fine, as long as they have that willingness and desire and that confident humility. But there's one interesting twist that I put on it, and that is to find an A player that's not connected to your team. Somebody that will have no relationship whatsoever to the selection that you make, because you're removing as much bias as possible from the position. They can come back and go, yeah, I don't know why you interviewed that person. Or they tend to see the company from a much bigger lens and the company's success, which is a nice outside view, and they're not biased by the members on the team. And it also helps, just in case you pick those people and you get a little bit of groupthink. It pulls a little bit of that out and gives you, Lisa, this independent view to say, hey, here's another data point for you to consider with this person.
Yeah, and to echo your point, George, and from my perspective, I do things kind of, differently and unorthodox. And, being in public sector, we, even though it's, being chief executive of a city, we have 5 different enterprises. We have public works, we have parks and rec, we have sewer, we have public safety. So we have different personalities with different backgrounds, and I don't know any of them. I'm just here for the party and to support them. And that's one of the big things that I always said, I work for them. And I work for them because in order for them to be able to do their jobs, they need the resources, they need the capital, they need the planning. And all I'm here to do is bring all that together. And so when we're bringing folks in, whether it's in administration or whether it's in, another department, like George said, we always bring somebody in from another department, whether it's administrative services, talking with public works, take the personalities and the characters. But I'm going to leave it with this. And I think one of the big things that I see in my position across the board, in many sectors, many industry, crap needs to roll downhill. And what I mean by that, too often we blame the lowest guy on the totem pole. We blame the rank and file, when in reality, we should be holding our supervisors and our leaders accountable for why did they fail, and was their failure a lack of you succeeding, and is there leadership development there? Do I have the wrong leadership in the wrong role? Did the Peterson principle take over? Is there something in there from our leadership? And I think too often, as we start moving up, we start feeling we less hold our leaders accountable like we should. And too often we've seen some of our hardest working A players leave an organization. And instead of saying, well, why did they leave and blame them? I say, okay, leader, what did you do? And what could we have done to keep this guy? And are you the problem? And so I think asking the tough questions, accepting the harder answer, and then putting a solution on the table to figure out what the next step is.
Yeah.
So Gwen Chambers is throwing this directly at George. Well, first, she's saying, I love your next best role. So George, please don't get your ego up on that one. But how does one actually know what their next best role is?
So let me start with this comment. One of the great things, it's great to be thought of as an A player, but I got to tell you this, the older you get, the more you realize you don't know as much as you thought you did. And when I was younger, I always thought of climbing the corporate ladder. We've all heard that phrase. But let me reorient everybody. It's not a corporate ladder. It's a corporate climbing wall. Meaning there's some times where you may need to go laterally, you may need to go down a little bit, or you may need to go horizontally. And so if you think of your career as a climbing wall, then your next best role is something where if you look at your resume, what block is not checked? What experience in your function, in a whole function? As an example, I'm a talent acquisition specialist, executive search, executive coaching, but the HR side of comp and benefits, or the HR side of human resources business partnering, is something that a block that I would like to check. So your next best role is usually filling in an empty block or taking a scope increase to the next level and the next challenge. So that might be laterally, it might be down a little bit, it may be horizontally, or it may be up. But it has to be, like we talked about, A players, it has to be additive and foundational to your career, expanding on something. It is never the same thing that you're currently in.
Yeah, and I definitely take this one sits close to home to me because I have a very nonlinear career path. After getting out of the military, like we all kind of did with the transition out of the military was rough. I went from a senior E7 in SF to a paramedic on the street, and I loved it, and it was good. And I learned along the way. I struggled along the way. I grew along the way and had challenges. And then I figured, started learning what are my objectives. And so maybe your next best role could be, what is your next best objective? So one of my goals was I wanted to affect change. I wanted to have that ability to affect change. Well, with who? With employees, with communities. So I started going down the healthcare route, which is kind of what I thought I was going to settle into. And it completely tanked, completely bombed out. And I accidentally fell into the public sector. And along the way, it was the ups and downs of everything, the struggles, the successes, the failures. But even where I'm at now, and I love my job where I'm at now, because the ultimate objective was I get to affect change on my employees, affect change on the community. You get to see the things that you want to do. So it may not necessarily be the next best role. It could be what do I believe in? What am I passionate about? Are you passionate about helping people? Well, what are you going to do next to help you accomplish your passion for people, your love of the job? So maybe just a different perspective, Gwen.
That's a real good one.
So I'm going to go around and let everybody kind of do their own last thoughts. If they've got something on the panel that they want to put out, Taryn's going to be the last. But something I wanted to say is, we've talked a lot, both from the hiring manager side as well as being an A player who's interviewing. Understand that sometimes, my last thought is understand that somebody who appears to be a B player in one area, we just haven't found the right seat for them. Now you have your certain C players that the amount of effort and energy and motivation and self-development they're willing to do, they're never going to climb up to be a B or an A player. And George just kind of mentioned that earlier. That's when you need to cut sling load and get rid of that heavy weight, that dead weight. But there are people there. There are people that you're either going to be interviewing with or that you're interviewing that aren't in the right position. So there's opportunities there. So not only having the best player, but the best team player for the team that you're looking at. And now I'm going to go to Dalton. What are your final thoughts?
I was thinking about this, and I really don't have many. This has been a really great conversation, overall. And I think, some of the big takeaways are cultures are changing, cultures are shifting. And, A players are always going to have a more challenging time because people see that success and they want to be that. And so find those other A players who are not going to hold you while you're down. They're going to lift you up and help you succeed. Surround yourself with those that are going to continue to challenge you and push you forward, right, wrong, or indifferent. And once you do achieve the role or achieve the objective that you're looking for, never forget where you came from, and not to dwell on the past, but so you can not help, not hand out, and give handouts to people, but to help bring other people up. Because even though I've gotten to the objective where I want and the position that I'm in, this is just the beginning for me, because now it's a step in a journey in how do we continue this process and how do we take this talent war and continue to build on this to bring other talented players out, even outside of the military, into those leadership roles that they can make a difference.
Yeah, well said. So I think Lisa froze, so I know it's going to come over to me. I would remind everybody that you can't outrun the collateral cost of a bad hire. Those effects are long-term, and they are very difficult to unwind. So it pays to take the time to understand what success looks like in the role that you're hiring for, to get A players to select A players, and that a butt in seat, quantity is not better than quality. Get a great A player because the return on your investment will be exponential. And to Dalton's point, those people will be lifting, training, mentoring, and coaching your B and your C players. And they will be not only additive, but exponentially beneficial to the entirety of your team and your ecosystem. So getting hiring right is everything. And so A players do that best.
All right, Taryn, you're on the hot seat.
Woohoo!
Oh, yay. Oh, yay. Okay, so I think the award goes to Dalton, for sure. I really like when we were talking about, B and C players, and you mentioning that sometimes you pull people in from your team, like, hey, shoot my good idea if need be, and see where they're kind of at. And it made me kind of realize that, hiring those A players and having them on your team, I think not only gives all the leadership, but the entire team the confidence to be able to do all of that, to run into somebody's office and ask, like, hey, I'm stuck, can you help? I also got a little sad. I felt like we, B and C players weren't getting a lot of attention, but, also, Dalton, you brought it up too, like, if anyone were to ask the four of us, hey, who's the smartest? No one's going to raise their hand. I think that it's true. Like, I would love to think of myself as an A player as well, but there's no way in the list of character attributes that I am 100% in all of them. I think what really sets A players apart is that they're constantly growing. They're constantly not only trying to develop themselves, but everybody that surrounds them. So and then love that we talked about authenticity, because I think that goes pretty far. And as George says, hire for character, training for skill. I think I read that somewhere, right?
Extra bonus points.
Yes.
Thanks, Taryn. And thanks, gentlemen. For anyone who's on here who still has some questions, we do monitor these. So go ahead, and if you watch it later, add a question in or send something in to Talent War Group. It might get a response via a blog or a vlog, which is hard to say. You'll see the website on the screen. Please come in and join us for next week on June 9th. I will be talking with a friend of mine, a new friend of mine, Allison Bradger. She's a major in the United States Army, but she's a former professor. She has more degrees than I can't even pronounce half the stuff she's really good at. She's a CrossFit athlete. She's a neurophysicist, I believe. Her resume is longer than some of the books I've read. So please join us next week at 1 p.m. Central Time to talk with Major Allison Bradger. If you do like the type of stuff that you're hearing from the Talent War Group, we have the Jedburgh podcast, which is hosted by Fran Rachapi. And the next episode 12, is coming out tomorrow. It's called Rhyme Antics with Chantel Calloway. To make a short story long or a long story short, however you need to hear it. But Fran has great guests on, and everybody comes to the point of adding value, completely different topics each time. It'll be an interesting one, Rhyme Antics, and that comes out tomorrow. Again, that's called the Jedburgh podcast. Everybody who listened in today, again, thank you, and we definitely appreciate the questions and comments. Have a fabulous afternoon. Thanks.